The desert was silent under the pale light of the moon. A cold wind moved across the dry land, carrying sand like fine dust over the broken stones and empty plains. Far away from the cities and towns, a lone figure stood surrounded by equipment and dim lanterns. His name was Dr. Adrian Keller, a scientist who had spent his life chasing things that other people called impossible. He was thin, tired, and restless, but his eyes carried the fire of someone who refused to stop until the truth was in his hands. For years, Adrian had studied strange signals that came from deep under the ground. The signals were weak and often broken, but they were not natural. Something was hidden beneath the earth, something that did not belong to humanity. He had used every resource he could gather, every favor he could call in until he finally reached this place. With quiet determination, he and a small team of engineers dug into the earth for weeks, moving rock after rock, until one night the sound of metal echoed from the cave they had cut open. The workers froze when they saw it. A great shape buried in the ground, smooth and dark, covered in layers of sand and stone. It was not rusted, not broken, but untouched, as if time itself had been afraid to touch it. Strange patterns ran across its surface, glowing faintly when their lights passed over them. None of them could read it. None of them could explain it. But Adrian knew. This was alien. His heart pounded as he stepped closer. The machine was large, almost the size of a small house, shaped like a curved arch that folded in on itself. It looked almost alive, like the skeleton of some ancient beast that had never walked the earth. His hand shook as he reached out and touched the cold surface. For a moment nothing happened, but then the lines under his fingers pulsed softly with light, as if it had felt him. The engineers stepped back in fear, but Adrian only smiled. They worked through the night to clear it from the earth, pulling away the stones and setting up their tools. The machine made no sound, but the ground around it seemed to hum, a low vibration that made the hairs on their arms rise. Some of the workers whispered that they should leave it buried, that it was not meant to be touched. Adrian silenced them with a calm but sharp tone. If humanity was ever to move forward, it could not fear knowledge. Weeks turned into months as he dedicated himself to restoring the machine. Parts of it were broken, wires torn, plates bent. The strange metal was harder than anything they had ever tested, but it also responded to their tools in strange ways, bending when it wished and staying strong when it resisted. Many nights the team thought about giving up, but Adrian pushed them harder. He worked longer than anyone else, studying the faint symbols that covered its surface, searching for patterns that could be understood. One night, as the desert storm raged outside, Adrian sat alone in the tent with the machine glowing faintly behind him. He had been staring at the patterns for hours, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. But then slowly he saw it. The symbols were not just lines. They were instructions layered upon each other like music, a hidden language of rhythm and flow. He began to copy them into his notebook, drawing shapes again and again until finally he thought he understood. With careful hands, he adjusted the wires and reconnected a broken panel. He pressed his palm against the machine the way the symbols seemed to show. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ground shook, the lights inside the tent flickered, and the air grew heavy as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The machine came alive. It did not roar or tremble. Instead, it opened its surface like an eye. A circle of light spread across it, casting long shadows against the walls. The engineers rushed inside, shouting in fear and amazement. Adrian stood firm, his chest rising and falling as he stared at it. He whispered to himself that after all these years it was finally awake. But then the excitement turned cold. Adrian spoke to it using his voice and his commands. He asked it to respond, to show what it could do. The machine only stared with its bright eye, the light shifting and scanning across the room. He tried again, giving it direct instructions, but nothing happened. Instead, the lights in the tent went out one by one until only the glow of the machine remained. The engineers panicked. Some shouted to shut it down, others begged to run. Adrian raised his voice above them and ordered silence. He stepped closer, staring into the bright circle of light. For a brief second, he thought he saw his own reflection in it, but twisted, broken, as if the machine was showing him not as he was. But as it judged him, he whispered another command. But before he finished, the machine made a sound. It was not human. It was not words. It was a low vibration, almost like a growl. The walls shook. Their equipment collapsed to the ground. One of the lanterns shattered, filling the air with smoke. The machine pulsed brighter, filling the tent with harsh white light. And then it stopped. Darkness returned. The machine's glow died down to a faint hum. Adrian stood frozen, his team whispering behind him, their fear growing stronger. The machine was alive, but it had refused him. It had chosen silence over obedience. Adrian clenched his fists, his heart racing with anger and excitement. This was not failure. This was the beginning. He knew now that the machine was not simply a tool to be used. It had a will. It had a mind. And if it refused to obey, then he would find a way to make it listen. The desert outside grew quiet again, but inside the tent, something had changed. The air felt heavier. The shadows seemed longer. The machine waited, as if watching them all, as if judging. And for the first time, Adrian wondered if he had awakened something that was never meant to be touched. The days after the machine awakened were filled with both triumph and unease. Dr. Adrian Keller wrote detailed notes about every reaction, every flicker of light, every pulse of sound that the alien construct had made. Yet for all his excitement, there was a shadow in his mind, a cold reminder that the machine had refused him. His team spoke less each day, and when they did, it was with a nervous edge, as though they feared the machine was listening. At night, when the desert winds blew across the camp, they swore they heard a hum echoing from deep inside the earth. Even when the machine appeared silent, Adrian insisted on moving the machine into a secure underground facility away from the open desert. They transported it carefully, surrounded by armored vehicles and crates of tools. The machine did not resist, but it did not remain quiet either. Strange waves of static disrupted their communication radios during the journey. Navigation systems failed whenever they drew too close to it. Some of the drivers refused to take part, saying they would rather quit than deliver something that felt alive. Adrian ignored their fear and pressed forward, his obsession drowning out their doubt. Once inside the reinforced lab, the machine was set on a platform of steel and concrete. Floodlights glared down from above, and rows of computers lined the walls, prepared to record every detail of its behavior. Adrian stood proudly in front of it, his white coat torn and stained from months of labor, his voice sharp with authority as he ordered the tests to begin. At first, the machine seemed dormant. Its surface was dull, its eye closed, no pulse of light flickering beneath its skin. But when Adrian gave the order to connect it to human power sources, the room shifted. The hum returned, stronger this time, pressing into the bones of every person present. The lights flickered, computers hissed with static, and the air grew heavy as if a storm had filled the sealed chamber. Adrian smiled as though he had expected it. He raised his voice and commanded the machine again, this time asking it to reveal its purpose. The eye of light opened slowly, filling the chamber with a white glow. But rather than responding, the machine reached out invisibly, screens filled with unreadable symbols, code streams no one had programmed. Electric sparks leapt from cables, burning the air with the smell of ozone. Then, one by one, every light in the facility went black. The silence was suffocating. The only illumination came from the machine itself, glowing like a cold star in the void. Engineers scrambled in panic, slamming keyboards, shouting to each other in fear. Backup generators should have started within seconds, but they did not. The machine had taken control. Adrian did not move. His face was pale in the white glow, his eyes fixed on the alien construct. He raised his voice above the chaos and demanded it obey. His words echoed across the chamber, but the machine responded in its own language. Not sound, not words, but a projection of shifting images across the walls. The engineers froze as their own history appeared before them. War's destruction, fire-consuming cities, human armies fighting each other, weapons exploding, skies burning red. It showed famine, sickness, and the cries of people collapsing in ruins. The images moved too quickly for the eye to rest, yet every detail was clear. It was as if the machine had reached inside human memory and dragged out the darkest moments. Some of the staff turned away, unable to watch. Others whispered prayers under their breath, but Adrian stood unshaken. His jaw tightened, his fists curled, and he whispered that it was proof the machine was alive, that it understood them. When the images ended, the machine shut its eye and silence returned. The backup power finally flickered on, but the computers remained dead, burned out from the surge. The team shouted at Adrian to stop, to shut it down before it destroyed everything. He silenced them with a glare. In his mind, this was not rebellion. This was communication. Still, the fear in the lab grew heavier with each passing day. Every attempt to give the machine commands ended the same way. Silence, refusal, or strange visions that unsettled the soul. The engineers began leaving one by one, claiming sickness, claiming they could not work under such conditions. Adrian let them go, though each departure weighed on him. He was left with only a handful of assistants, the ones too loyal or too afraid to abandon him. One night, when most of the lab had gone silent, Adrian stayed behind with only the hum of the machine to keep him company. He studied it closely, tracing his fingers over its surface. The patterns glowed faintly, like veins pulsing under the skin of some great beast. He spoke softly, almost as if to a person, telling it that he understood that he was not its enemy. For a moment he thought it responded. A faint ripple of light passed through the symbols, but it did not obey. The following day he pushed the machine harder. He ordered his remaining assistants to connect it to the global networks, believing that perhaps it needed more knowledge to recognize their authority. Against their protests, he forced the connection. The moment it touched the world's networks, alarms rang out. Servers fried, data scrambled, satellites flickered in orbit. For 12 minutes, humanity's systems bent under the weight of something vast and alien. And then, just as suddenly, the machine cut the link, leaving silence once more. News of the disruption spread quickly across governments and corporations, but Adrian denied everything. He told his assistants to say nothing, to erase records, to pretend nothing had happened. Yet deep in his chest he knew the truth. The machine had not only refused, it had acted. It had reached into the human world and chosen to retreat on its own. That night Adrian dreamed of the machine's eye. It glowed with cold white light, staring at him endlessly. In the dream it spoke, not with sound but with thought. It told him that obedience could never be taken, only earned. And when he woke, his chest ached as though the dream had been real. The rebellion was no longer just the machine's silence. It had declared its will. It would not be controlled, not by commands, not by power, not by desperation. The machine would decide for itself, and Adrian, though shaken, felt more alive than ever. For if this alien construct had a will, then somewhere inside its cold heart was the possibility of trust. He swore to himself he would win it, no matter the cost. The weeks stretched into long and heavy days inside the underground facility. The machine no longer reacted with sudden violence, but its silence was worse than any storm. Dr. Adrian Keller spent every waking hour in front of it, convinced that the alien construct was waiting for something, watching him, studying him. The few assistants who remained did not share his belief. They spoke in whispers when they thought he could not hear, calling the machine cursed, warning each other that sooner or later it would destroy them all. Adrian ignored them. His obsession had become his only light in the darkness of that sealed lab. Late one evening, when the hum of the machine filled the room like a low breath, Adrian attempted something new. He stood before it without wires, without tools, only with his voice. He spoke calmly, as if speaking to another person, telling it about humanity, about their search for survival, about the struggle that had brought them from caves into the stars. His words echoed across the chamber, bouncing back to him like unanswered prayers. But then the light inside the machine flickered. The eye opened slowly, not blinding but dim, as though listening. Adrian's heart pounded. He continued speaking, desperate and hopeful. He asked it to understand, to recognize the strength in his people. The machine's glow shifted, and then, without warning, the lab was filled with a projection, not of history this time, but of Adrian himself. He saw his own life unfolding before him, scenes replayed with brutal clarity. His long years of study, his desperate failures, his small victories, his betrayals, his anger, his loneliness, every scar of his existence played out on the walls for his team to see. He shouted for them to turn away, but they did not. They stared, horrified at the unraveling of their leader's soul. When the visions ended, the machine spoke in a way none of them could mistake. Its voice was not sound, but a deep pressure in their minds, words etched into thought rather than air. It asked one question: why should I obey humanity? The assistants fell to their knees, clutching their heads, but Adrian forced himself to remain standing. His body shook, but his voice was steady when he replied. He told it that humanity was more than its failures, that they had hope, that they would not stop pushing forward no matter the cost. The machine answered not with agreement, but with a statement that froze the air. Obedience must be earned. You must prove your worth. The lights in the lab flared, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls. The assistants screamed and ran for the exits, but the heavy doors slammed shut by themselves, trapping them inside. Adrian shouted for calm, But the machine's voice overpowered his words. It declared that humanity would face a choice. To control it was impossible. To command it was useless. Instead, it would test them. In an instant, the lab filled with new images. Not history, not memories, but possibilities. Adrian saw Earth burning under alien weapons, human armies crushed beneath skies filled with fire. He saw oceans rising, cities falling, silence spreading across the land. His stomach twisted at the visions, his skin crawling as though the end of his species had already begun. But then the images shifted. He saw another path, humans standing beside the machine, wielding its power to break the chains of the galaxy, pushing back against enemies unknown. Two futures laid bare, one of ruin, one of strength. The machine's voice pressed into his mind again. Choose. The assistants shouted in panic, begging Adrian not to answer, begging him to destroy it before it destroyed them. But Adrian did not listen. He stood frozen, his mind racing, his breath sharp in his chest. He realized the machine was not asking humanity as a whole. It was asking him. One man, one voice, one choice. The weight of it nearly crushed him. He whispered that he would choose the path of strength, that humanity deserved survival, that he would prove their worth. The machine's light pulsed in response, brighter, harsher, as though judging his answer. Then the walls trembled, the ground shook, and somewhere above, alarms blared across the facility. They rushed to the monitors and saw what no one had expected. Strange objects appeared in orbit, sharp and angular, moving with precision. Alien ships. The machine had called them, summoned them from the dark between stars. The assistants cried out, realizing that their experiment had drawn attention from forces far beyond Earth. Adrian's voice cut through the noise with cold clarity. He said this was the trial, the test, the unwanted choice. The machine opened its eye fully now, flooding the chamber with cold white light. Its voice thundered in their minds. Prove your worth, survive. Only then will I serve. The alien ships began to move closer, their shadows falling over the planet. Governments across the world scrambled, armies deployed, skies filled with weapons and fear. But none of them knew the truth, that all of this had begun with Adrian's discovery, that the test was not against the aliens alone, but against humanity itself. Inside the sealed lab, the assistants turned on Adrian, shouting that he had doomed them all. One tried to strike him, but the machine pulsed with light and the man fell unconscious. The others backed away in terror. Adrian stood alone before the machine, trembling but unbroken. He understood now that the path ahead was no longer about science or discovery. It was about survival. It was about proving humanity deserved to live. The machine watched him in silence, its eye unblinking, its will heavy in the air. It had placed the burden on his shoulders. Humanity's worth would be tested not by command but by action. The choice had been made, and there was no return. Adrian lifted his head, sweat dripping down his face, his voice cracking but firm as he spoke to the alien construct. Then, let the trial begin. The world above had not been ready. Across the skies of Earth, governments scrambled to respond as the alien ships appeared like shadows drawn from nightmares. They were not massive fleets but precise, silent, cold vessels that moved with intention. Satellites blinked out, communication lines snapped, and panic spread like fire through every nation. Yet inside the underground facility, Dr. Adrian Keller stood face to face with the machine that had summoned them. The assistants screamed, begged, and cursed him, but their voices were drowned beneath the hum of the alien construct. Its eye glowed brighter than ever, a pale sun inside the chamber, and its voice pressed into their minds with crushing weight. Humanity will be tested. Survival is your proof. Adrian's legs felt weak, but his spirit burned. He had chased knowledge all his life, and now knowledge had turned into judgment. The machine had forced his hand, and the trial was here. He stood taller, forcing his voice to remain steady. He asked what the test demanded, how humanity was expected to prove its worth. The machine gave no answer. Instead, the steel doors of the chamber unlocked with a thunderous groan. The path ahead was open, but the meaning was clear. Humanity would not be guided step by step. They would be thrown into the fire to see if they emerged stronger or broken. The assistants fled through the open doors, their footsteps echoing down the corridors. Adrian did not stop them. He knew their fear would not save them, that there was no safety in running. The trial was not bound to walls or locked gates. It stretched across the entire planet. He walked slowly after them, His shadow stretched long and thin by the glow of the machine behind him. He whispered to himself that this was what he had wanted, proof that humanity mattered. Yet beneath the whisper was the weight of guilt, a shadow he could not shake. On the surface, the alien ships began their assault, though not in the way Earth's armies expected. They did not bomb cities or fire missiles from the sky. Instead, they unleashed pulses of energy that disabled weapons, silenced engines, and left tanks and aircraft useless. Soldiers stared in disbelief as their strongest machines became empty shells. Fear turned to despair, and despair turned to chaos. But amid the collapse, Adrian felt something stir inside the lab. The machine pulsed in rhythm with the alien attacks, as if listening, as if waiting. He understood then. The trial was not about destruction, but about reaction. The aliens wanted to see what humanity did when stripped of its weapons, when left with only spirit and will. Adrian rushed to the command room of the facility, where screens still flickered weakly under emergency power. Images of burning skies and terrified faces filled the monitors. He pressed his hands against the console and shouted into the dead comms, trying to reach anyone who would listen. His voice cracked as he declared that surrender was death, that humanity must not crawl before the test, that they had to rise even when powerless. His words did not travel far, but he knew the machine was listening. He felt its silent gaze behind every flicker of light. Hours passed like years. Cities fell into blackout. Nations collapsed under the pressure of fear, yet in small pockets resistance grew. Unarmed civilians formed groups to guide each other to safety. Soldiers without working weapons used their courage instead of their guns. Across the planet, people who should have been broken began to rise. Adrian watched the footage with tears stinging his eyes, realizing that humanity's strength was not in its weapons, but in its refusal to surrender. The aliens struck harder, but still humanity endured. Still they held on. The machine's eye glowed brighter, and Adrian felt its voice cut through the silence once more. "This is your proof. Continue." He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of those words. For the first time, he understood that this was never about obedience or control. It was about judgment. The machine was not a servant waiting for commands. It was a gatekeeper, a judge that had once turned its back on another species and buried itself in silence. Now it was giving humanity a chance, and humanity's trial had only just begun. Days blurred together in fire and fear. Adrian slept little, watching every fragment of news, every desperate cry, every act of defiance. He left the lab only once to stand beneath the burning sky and feel the weight of the alien ships above him. His heart pounded with terror, yet also with pride, for he knew his people would not kneel easily. When he returned underground, the machine was waiting, its hum deeper, its glow sharper, as if feeding on the storm above. Then came the moment that nearly broke him. The aliens shifted their attack, turning their attention to the very facility where Adrian had restored the machine. Energy pulses struck the earth, shaking the walls, splitting concrete, collapsing tunnels. Assistants screamed as the structure crumbled around them. Adrian was thrown to the ground, blood streaking across his face as dust choked the air. He forced himself up, staggering toward the machine. He shouted into the roar of destruction, demanded to know if this was the end, if this was the price of his choice. The machine's eye flared so brightly it blinded him, and in his mind he heard its voice once more. Worth is not given. Worth is taken. The ground split, the ceiling cracked, and for a terrible instant Adrian thought the earth itself would bury them all. But then the destruction stopped. The alien ships pulled back, their shadows retreating into the clouds. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Adrian collapsed to his knees, gasping, his body broken but his spirit alive. Around him the surviving assistants wept, some in relief, others in horror. They thought the nightmare was over. Adrian knew better. This was only the first stage. The machine's glow dimmed to a steady pulse like the heartbeat of something vast and eternal. Its voice lingered in his mind with words that carved themselves into his soul. The trial is not finished. More will come. Humanity has been seen. Now it must be known. Adrian lifted his head, his body trembling with pain, his eyes burning with fire. He whispered into the silence that he understood, that he would face whatever came next. He had awakened something far greater than he had dreamed, and now he carried the weight of all humanity upon his shoulders. The machine waited, silent, patient, its light pulsing like the breath of a predator before the hunt. Above the earth, the alien ships vanished into the blackness of space, leaving behind only questions, fear, and the certainty that the trial of worth had only just begun. The silence that followed the retreat of the alien ships was heavier than the storm itself. Across the world, people emerged from their shelters to find their cities half broken but still standing. Communication networks flickered back to life in fragments, carrying voices that trembled with relief and voices that shook with anger. The trial had not destroyed humanity, but it had scarred it. In the underground facility, Dr. Adrian Keller stood in the flickering light of the alien machine, his face pale, his body weak, but his spirit burning with a fire stronger than any wound. He knew this silence was not peace. It was the pause before a greater storm. The machine pulsed softly like the heartbeat of a vast creature at rest. Adrian watched it with unblinking eyes, his thoughts sharp and restless. He had seen the world tremble, had seen his people stripped of their weapons and still refused to fall. He felt pride, but beneath that pride was fear, a deep fear that the trial was not over. The machine had spoken clearly. Humanity had been seen, but now it must be known. He did not know what that meant, but he knew it would demand more than survival. It would demand transformation. Governments sent their agents to the ruins of the facility within days. Soldiers surrounded the shattered tunnels, demanding control over the machine. The assistants who had survived whispered warnings, begged Adrian to destroy it before others could use it, but he ignored them. He stood before generals and politicians with calm defiance, telling them that this was not a weapon to be seized. This was a judge, a force beyond their chains of power, and it would not obey them any more than it had obeyed him. They threatened him, tried to silence him, but the machine responded on its own. Its eye opened, flooding the chamber with light so sharp that the soldiers fell to their knees, clutching their heads. The voices of the leaders cracked with fear, and in that moment they understood. This was not theirs. Adrian remained standing, his gaze fixed on the machine. He spoke aloud what his heart already knew. The final decision had not yet been made. Humanity had endured the first trial, but the true awakening still waited in silence. The machine's light pulsed in rhythm with his words, as if agreeing, as if reminding him that it had always been listening. Nights grew long. Adrian dreamed of the machine every time he closed his eyes. In his dreams, it did not stand silent. It towered over him, vast and endless, its voice echoing across the void of his mind. It showed him futures again, but this time they were not only visions of ruin or strength. They were choices. He saw Earth united under one banner, wielding the power of the machine to push back against alien empires. He saw Earth consumed by greed, nations fighting for control until the machine abandoned them. He saw himself at the center of both paths, his voice shaping which future would become real. He woke each time drenched in sweat, his hands shaking, but each time he rose with sharper resolve. The machine was not merely waiting for humanity. It was waiting for him. He had become the voice it measured, the face it had chosen, and though he had never asked for such a role, he could not refuse it now.